Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Autonomous Health Podcast. This is your host Anmol Matan, and today we're going to talk about building and scaling high-performing teams at the intersection of AI and healthcare with two incredible people, Peg Olson and Abbie Turek. Peg and Abbie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yo.
And just before we got on, Peg was joking that it's so nice to get the band together. And the funny thing is, this is meant to be a easy, fun conversation. And Peg and Abbie, I think it would be very helpful to people to hear about your backgrounds and things you've done, because I'd say both of you have unique experiences building high-performing teams, helping companies scale, thinking a lot about AI talent and what that means in this market, in the world that we're in, with all the innovations that have happened especially in generative AI and the buzz around it in the last 6 months, but also the macro trends. So these are all topics we'll dig into. But let's start off by maybe some background on both of you. Would be great if you talk about what brought you to recruiting and team building, what gets you excited about it, and just for people to meet you as people.
Great. Okay. My name is Peg Olson, and I've been recruiting for 3 decades now. So if that ages me, oh well. I had no intent of ever being a recruiter when I grew up. I didn't know what it was. I fell into it and it stuck, and I love what I do. But mostly I love helping build teams. I love helping companies that are going through major transition. And in the course of those 3 decades, I've had a chance to see a lot of interesting transformation, I guess, in technology, because I started in the .com boom out in California and, saw the supply and demand and the change of that and how it affected it. But we didn't really have email. We still weren't fully automated yet. So it was really fun kind of helping those companies find the talent that they needed. I've helped 2 companies, I guess, as a consultant scale, E-Trade being one, before I went into healthcare exclusively and ended up at Livongo through that course of time, through a contact I had at E-Trade 25 years ago, and went in to just support them for a couple of hours and fell in love and had the opportunity to work with leaders all across the organization. I didn't focus as much on AI, but I did data science. I did a lot of clinical product. I helped scale the growth marketing team, the product team, the design team from inception, all which in that course of time were really hard to fill roles, because growth marketing was just evolving, with marketing becoming, I think, more of a revenue than a cost center. And design was really evolving with UX and UI. So I think there's no real template, I think, for recruiting for AI today, because we're just seeing it. We're just scaling it. And we have to kind of take what we've learned from the past and anticipate and plan for what we can do based on lessons learned. So, and today I have my own firm, which I focus exclusively on health technology, growth stage companies, from seed on up. So
awesome. That's very cool, Peg. Abbie, quick introduction and sharing your journey here as well.
Yeah. Hi. So I started actually recruiting 12 plus years ago in the tech space, actually more on the staffing agency side of the house. So contract to hire, then moved in-house, worked for a true software consulting company, did a small stint where I was on my own and kind of this, not as large of a scale from like an E-Trade and what Peg was doing, but really helping smaller companies and sort of build out their infrastructure around recruiting, best practices, standardizing process procedures, how to sell, what we were recruiting for. Kind of fast forward, we all worked together at Livongo, right? So we were in hyper growth mode at the time that I came into Livongo and hiring. I think one of the things I love specifically about tech recruiting is just how fast paced it is, that technologies are always changing. There's so many new and exciting things to sell the candidates beyond just a company's mission. Obviously AI is more of the hot buzzword these last couple of years. Prior to that, it was talking about cloud, right? And the cloud space and finding, architects and people with those specialties. So I love working with people and helping them find jobs. And, as my career progressed, really getting more into the companies at a more strategic level and helping them build and scale their teams has been really fun and exciting. And so today I'm actually working for an acute telehealth company who's also in high growth mode and kind of starting from bare bones in a sense and helping them kind of scale and grow.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so there's something you said there, Peg, and I'm going to sort of pose this question in some ways to both of you, actually, which is you mentioned you've been doing this for 30 years, if I heard you correctly, right? Close to 3 decades.
Yes. Yes.
And Abbie, I know you've spent a fair amount of time as well. Have some things changed and have some things stayed the same? When you think of those 3 decades, like what has changed and what stays the same when it comes to, let's just talk about technical recruiting, and then we'll talk a little bit more about leadership roles as well in a minute.
I think for me, recruiting overall has probably changed even more so than Abbie, because when I started, with a fax machine, a phone book to try to find candidates. Yeah. You had to go to networking events, so it was very different. So I think technology in itself is changing recruiting, more or less what AI is going to do to help talent. But I think the core things about recruiting have stayed the same in my mind, because you have to be good.
And what are those core things? What things have stayed the same?
The core things are being able to build relationships with people, being empathetic and understanding people, being able to direct source. And I think that's where, Abbie and I can add more value. And sometimes where people fall short in scaling their internal recruiting teams is they don't hire people that had been on the agency side and that have had to actually direct source candidates. I grew up in that even before, just because I didn't have technology. But LinkedIn, it really evolved, the ability to recruit and network and things like that too. So
I think I'll comment on some of the changes, on how we're selling, right? We have different generations of people that expect different things out of companies and their value proposition and what's important to them. Where before you're just kind of selling the job, you're finding candidates, you're sort of fitting them in. Now it's such a bigger picture with, this new generation is really passionate about, how the company's given back. What is their mission? What is the impact they're going to have on the teams as they continue to grow? So it's really a lot more of those soft skills oftentimes that they're really being sold on. And that recruiters have to do a really great job in really understanding what those value adds are.
Yeah. Yeah. Changing mindsets.
Absolutely. And the company overall, I think, has to be aligned on all of that. And each demographic of, like you said, age and discipline, certain things appeal to them more than others.
Yeah.
And I think it's very different for technology.
It's very fascinating. And so, Abbie, I'll start. I'll throw a question at you, and Peg, please feel free to chime in too here. There's obviously a lot happening in the world of AI, and I feel like the last 10, 15 years, we've only seen it accelerate. And you and I have worked together over the years across many different AI, data science, machine learning type of roles, data engineering roles. What are the secrets to building high performing teams here? Are there some best practices? Are there some recommendations? Are there things that companies often kind of do that are mistakes that they should avoid? I mean, do you want to give the audience a sense of all of that?
Yeah, and I think too, one thing that, because it's such a buzzword right now, AI means different things to different companies on how they're utilizing it, what tools and technology. So I think, from a recruiter talking to a candidate, right, being able to define what is AI to that company. Again, what is their story? What is the impact that this particular individual will have in joining the teams? And honestly, a lot of it around aptitude and attitude, right? I think, of course, there's core basic things and fundamentally what you need to have walk in the door for machine learning and data scientists and all the in-betweens. But really understanding, the growth opportunity. Can this person learn? This isn't going away, right? It's going to continue to evolve and technology, and people are going to figure out how to fit into AI as it grows. So I think it's just really important to understand like what that company's story is when it comes to AI and how they're going to use it and learn it and grow with technology and AI specifically.
Yeah. And there's something interesting you said earlier, which is it's sort of like another generation of, hiring product managers or designers or software engineers. So we have maybe a few more decades or a couple of decades ahead of experience. Are there parallels from how those, how people build great teams in those sort of technical areas that apply to AI roles, you think?
You comment on that, Peg?
Yeah, go ahead, Peg. I see you nodding your head. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I have learned is, I guess I've learned a lot from both sides, what not to do and what to do right. I think Livongo honestly did a lot of things right.
Yeah.
And that is, they had pretty defined recruiting processes in place. I think with AI talent or technical talent across the board, the process needs to be super streamlined because they're not going to be around long. They don't have the patience. You have to be nimble and move quickly to get them. So having a defined hiring process is super important. But it starts from the top, right? With culture. You have to be able to sell your company. You have to be able to sell your strategy around technology, your roadmap, because they want to be challenged. They want to learn constantly, or they're going to leave. And with technology today, it crosses so many different domains. They can leave and go anywhere, you know? And I think a lot of the technology people that I meet are very interested in their growth opportunity, right? What they're going to learn, new skills are going to be added. They need to be passionate about the projects that they're working on. And if not, you're going to lose them. So you really have to plan how you communicate your story and define the process. Then I think you have to understand the talent pool you're going after and figure that out. And that can be iterating and being really creative on how you find that talent. I knew when I do outreach to candidates, it's very different based on their domain and what they're doing. And certain demographics, like Abbie said, really care about the mission. I found with some of the engineering leaders, though, that I've recruited, I was appealing to the mission and they weren't replying to me until I appealed to the products, the projects, the growth opportunity, and the things like that, that then they started responding and wanting to have conversations. So, you know, it's a lot of iteration, but I think if there were a defined playbook, Abbie and I'd be retired and living on a beach right now. I think it's constantly changing with your company. It depends on the size of your company, even with AI, right? A startup AI team you're gonna have to build it differently than you would thinking about AI in a huge company.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peg, on just, some of that's not necessarily specific to AI, but just recruiting in general, on having, really great process in place that's inclusive. I think for data science in general, they're very data oriented, right? So they want to know more about like what specific projects they're working on, what's to come, how does that impact their growth and learning and career development more specifically if they decide to take our job over the other 9 companies that may be pursuing them. And also just feeling that tie into their hiring manager, their team, right? There has to be a level of cohesiveness and collaboration that they're really excited about joining. Especially with this day and age of virtual and remote, right? Again, that adds another layer of how we recruit and how we build cohesive teams.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I heard a few themes there that I'm going to restate because I think this is actually really important for the audience, which is having the right culture and the mission that attracts people, running an efficient sort of process, feeding into curiosity. And I would agree with that point, Peg, and Abbie in particular, because a lot of people who end up, getting PhDs or advanced degrees, graduate degrees, do it because they're actually really interested in learning about the field. They're curious people to begin with. And so if they don't see a chance to see that in the company that they're joining, it's harder to attract that kind of technical talent. Often I find people who make really good additions to our AI or technical teams are the people who'd be working on those projects, even if they didn't have a job, right? That's what, they would do on a weekend for fun, right? And so getting that kind of person in your company also requires that you feed their curiosity, you feed their intellectual need and appetite. So I think those are really, really important points as we think of building pieces. The other piece that I think both of you started to touch into, which I've seen a lot of as well, which is the words mean very different things to different people. And even across healthcare, when we often use the word AI, I'm finding when people say AI, they sometimes mean data science, they sometimes mean large language models, sometimes they mean, radiology and imaging, like they mean completely different things to the person in the room. And I find that because this is a relatively new job description, and maybe it's 10 years old, 5 years old, depending on when you want to start counting it, it's sort of like the calibration is actually really essential to bringing talent, because what you consider great or what you consider high performing talent might actually be completely different across those different types of roles as well. And so I think
absolutely
part of success here is us as cross-functional teams kind of working to find that definition and calibration right.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the in anticipation, which I've thought a lot about, is like, how do you anticipate the needs that we're going to have, right, with AI, because it's going to be really crazy. So what do you do to prepare for it? And companies that are the most prepared are probably going to win that battle for talent. So doing it immediately is important. But as I thought about the difference, even in just recruiting since the pandemic, right, is how much more important. You were talking about PhDs and different things, but I think looking at figuring out your team from your roadmap and what specific technical skills you need, both not just technical, but the soft skills, right? And I think the soft skills for a collaborative culture, and just since the pandemic, have become so important because we've had a window into people's lives, right? So I think the soft skills, like the communication, the presentation, those things, when sometimes people think of AI or technology, they just think of the skills, right? The skill sets or the education needed for it. But when you're recruiting, I think you need to really evaluate those other things too, and don't miss those pieces.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point for AI teams because AI teams work in close concert with product, with clinical, with engineering, sometimes even with the commercial sales teams and so on. So the kind of person you're looking for is not just they need to absolutely have the technical chops and understand the things they're building, but they often need to engage with different audiences as well. And I think that cross team communication, collaboration is really vital and often sort of underappreciated.
Absolutely.
Right. I find like first time managers are like, this person's really strong on the code and like they're, a little grumpy to work with, but we'll make that work. I'm like, probably not. That's going to be a deal breaker.
No, that's going to be a deal breaker right there. Yeah, it's interesting, that EQ piece. When you think about technology and AI right now, it does, like, it crosses product. If they don't understand your customer and your end user, how can you be good at collaborating and building the technology across the organization, right? So it spans everything end to end, and they have to be good communicators.
One thing I was just going to add to that is, we're talking more specifically about recruiting AI, right, and different subsets of that. And I think one of the things to think about, right, from a company standpoint, is not just talking the talk, but also how are we utilizing it across the company? So not just how are we recruiting it for a particular role, how is recruiting using it? How are hiring managers using it? Like, are they really actually embracing what AI is and the capabilities? I know for me, like, I use it every day, right? I'm in ChatGPT's one of the hot new open AI tools right now. And, I'm figuring out how to automate things as much as I can using that to my advantage. I think we need to continue to think about that in other technical roles, recruiting roles, across operational roles.
Yeah.
It's going to take over so many different things. And then we can better spend our time on the things that matter, right? As we're thinking about recruiting and who we're recruiting.
Yeah.
Well, and I think with all those changes that are happening, like you just said, Abbie, across every department, I think from the top, the leaders need to communicate those changes constantly so people aren't intimidated by it, because people, they don't like change very much. We see that happen with integrations and whatever. And so I think that communication on what is happening will help with the collaboration and the fear factor that can set in when people see all this stuff, like, am I going to lose my job? And
Yeah.
And I think if the teams feel more comfortable with it, and also if they have the opportunity to learn some of the new skills, they'll stay.
So we had some good discussion on the individual hire sort of talent, what to look for, how companies position themselves to attract good talent and bring people to the door. I want to switch sides and talk a little bit about building strong cross-functional organizations. And I think that has two flavors, Peg and Abbie. I'd love your thoughts on both of those. So one is, how do you look for leaders of AI and data science and machine learning, and what should organizations do? I often kind of talk to CEOs or founders, or especially in sort of traditional healthcare, where it's like, well, we need to have an AI strategy. We need to go look for someone who's going to like bring in generative AI into our health system or our health plan, right? So how do those leaders end up in organizations? What to look for there? What attributes do you look for? That's one flavor. Part two is, you also need cross-functional alignment, because no AI product in my multi-decade career has ever shipped without support from a product manager, a clinical lead or executive or chief medical officer. And so I think that sort of 3 or 4, engineering, product, clinical working together is really important as well. And so So what do you look for in leaders, both for AI, but also what do you look for in leaders in those other areas to accelerate the adoption of AI? Because you could have a clinical product leader who doesn't believe in AI. Those attributes that could be really essential. So it's a two-part question. Curious about your thoughts on those.
I work a lot with early stage companies. I've worked with both, but in working with a majority of my clients right now in earlier stage healthcare, I think it's important. Past performance is indicative of future performance, right? And collaboration is so important. I mean, you need to have the technical skills, that goes without a doubt, and probably at the most senior level, right? They're the people that are going to have your PhDs or whatever, that, and check all of those boxes. But really digging into the softer skills and how they lead, how they mentor, how they're going to develop people. All of those things I think are super, super critical. But hiring that first person, I think they should also be able to attract other talent, right? Because you're going to be in a very competitive landscape where the first place people go is to look up the leaders' bios. And so number one, the bios need to be out there and super polished. Not just about their technical skills, about who they are as a leader, because people judge that. So I think the first hires should be people that are going to attract the talent and who have all, the skill sets across the board.
And I would add too, I think, with some of the roles we've worked on in the past together on Mala, is letting them have experience with building and scaling teams and actually understanding how they're collaborating with IT, engineering, if they have data science, like what was their involvement in collaboration, having them kind of speak to specific projects. And maybe it could even be passion projects, to your point, that they're working on the side on, they're trying to, intersect what they're passionate about with their work. And they might not have the exact scaling experience. They do have maybe really great experience working with engineering teams, collaborating with, the chiefs of those teams within product, data science, engineering. I think that's really going to be important to make sure as a small company and you scale that they're used to having those conversations and other voices in the room.
Absolutely. That's one of the questions I ask a lot is walk me, through your day and who are you interacting with? What teams are you partnering with? Where have there been issues? How have you resolved those issues? A lot of those things to really dig in on how they've done that. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think one of my early mentors early in my career gave me this advice once, and I've sort of carried in, which is the job of a technical leader often is not to be the person, who understands the code the best or can write the most code or stuff like that. But the job of the leader is to build a high performing team, right? That can build the best product in the least amount of time in the most collaborative manner, right? So it really is a different mindset. And I think part of what I find as companies are thinking about that leadership role, to your point, Peg, is maybe we look for them outside. You've got a track record, but also sometimes you find people within the organization that have that instinct, the people management or kind of team building, capability or instinct or DNA for that. And then it's really about sort of chiseling that and shaping that into becoming leaders inside the organization too, has often worked very well too.
Well, that comes with the retention and engagement, right? If they see that, they're going to stay.
Yeah.
Also if they feel appreciated and you celebrate the wins and, people leave people. And most often than not, I think people leave because they don't feel appreciated or noticed, or they haven't been given opportunity.
Yeah, and I think there's two parts, right? I think there's the retention piece where people can be high performing in a particular role. And, often they're what we call career levels in companies, right? So there's a certain level where that's a great long-term career level for a person, sort of mid-level. And then sometimes you find people where they just have an instinct for working with others. And you can kind of see them play the hat of a people manager at scale, be a senior leader in 5 or 10 years, right? And sometimes I'll talk to a person and they'll be early in their career, but I'm like, yeah, that person's going to be, VP of something in 5 years, right? If they're given the opportunity. So I think it's sort of being open to that as well.
Well, that makes you a good leader if you're doing that, because you're recognizing the people and where they fit best. There are people who love being individual contributors, and that's okay. I dodged leading people a majority of my career because I loved being an individual contributor. And it's not because I don't like collaborating with people. It's just, so I think recognizing people's strengths and utilizing those to the best advantage for the team, right? Someone could be a real introvert. How do you make them feel comfortable? So.
And then going back to the other part of this question, my question started to be a little long. I'm sorry, but the other part of this question, which is, you're looking. I mean, we're looking for high performing cross functional teams. And so, how do you think of a product manager that's going to work well with an AI scientist, or a clinical leader who's going to work well with an AI scientist, and vice versa? An AI scientist is going to collaborate effectively with them. Do you have any advice for companies how to set that up for success? And I find that when you bring the right people with the right attitudes, it can really amplify the different functions. And when you don't have the right attitudes, or we don't sort of bring the right people in, it kind of like pulls everybody back. So any advice on sort of building those types of cross-functional teams?
I think it's easier to, you need to build that culture from the beginning. So it's obviously easier if you're building it than if you have this United Healthcare giant behemoth company where you're going in and trying to change everything, right?
Right.
So starting it, I think it crosses every discipline is, what is your culture? What are your goals? Your people need to know the mission. It's one of the things I think about Livongo. Everyone was rowing in the same direction. The mission was constantly discussed. Your goals were constantly discussed. You were held accountable, and everybody held each other accountable, but not in a competitive, mean way. Having a culture where people aren't afraid, meaning they're not afraid to agree to disagree, that their ideas are welcomed, whether it's brainstorming, whatever you do to encourage that. For some of the people that might not be as apt to speak out,
Yeah.
but have great ideas. So, I mean, there's just so many things that, people need to feel supported.
Abbie, what's your experience? You've had a lot of product managers and engineers.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the tactical things. So Peg kind of hit on something of, when you're putting employees into jobs and you're giving them roles and responsibilities, let's give them things and projects where we're highlighting what their skill sets are. Why would we force somebody who maybe their weakness is something and then we're reprimanding them for them not doing it the way we want, or, not getting the best output from them? So really leaning into during the interview process, right? Making sure that it's inclusive, and where could we envision this person fitting into the projects we're working on, the teams and the people that we're currently working with. I think one thing that we did, and this was a pivot for all of us, was moving away from single interviews where we're gathering information outside of each other to putting everybody in the same room and making it a comfortable situation so we can see the live person on the other end we're interviewing and how they collaborate, how they answer, how they talk under pressure and give their answers in a warm environment, right? That's inviting.
Agree. I think that's why that works so well for product and across the board.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I look for is sort of like humility about your own field and respect and curiosity about the other fields. And so I find like, for an AI person to kind of understand that they've got to work and sort of understand the product managers are really good at what they do, and listen and be open to their way of solving problems, or listen to clinical insight from a seasoned leader is actually really essential for success. And I think when people sort of over index on their field and they disregard the other fields is when I see things break. And so I test for that in a lot of the interview process early on. Is this person able to kind of appreciate the success of the team over themselves?
Well, being humble, don't let your ego get involved, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, there's a lot of advanced degrees here.
Yeah, it makes life a lot easier. So,
yeah. And then, one more question for you all, which is, let's talk about the macro world we're living in. And it feels like, if you step out of obviously recruiting for AI, recruiting for healthcare, it's a bit of a tale of two cities. And what I mean by that, on one end, when you look at digital health or healthcare, it's sort of the funding and investment has compressed in the last couple of years, and the macro climate has changed. And there's some recent data as we record here that, Q2 was the sixth straight quarter that digital healthcare funding was declining. All right, so that's a trend. We've seen that. We've seen companies have to trim headcount. We've seen companies make strategic decisions about offshoring, do all sorts of interesting things there to kind of live in that new world. And then on the flip side, we're seeing unprecedented kind of, sort of growth or appetite for AI, fueled primarily by generative AI, large language models, and every, recent health plan conference in Portland earlier this summer. And it was like every health plan, leader is asking about what should I do with generative AI and how does it fit into my workflows? And it's sort of like there's this sort of appetite for it. And so talk to me about how you see those two trends fitting in, advice for both companies that are looking to build teams, and it still continues to be a competitive market, perhaps for these roles, as well as advice for any candidates here as well. So thoughts on that macro trend?
Well, the funding issue, I think, of course, is so imperative for earlier stage companies because you want to be able to iterate quickly so you get another round of funding. So you want to be really successful out of the gate, right?
Yeah.
Abbie, you want to mention? I can't think where I was.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, obviously during COVID, right, that's where we saw all of these smaller companies coming out getting funding. So I read a few articles on that. And I'm curious if it's just a slowdown also of newer companies coming to the table because it is a bit saturated at the moment. Obviously, also, we've seen these thousands and thousands of, tech layoffs, right, adding to the mix. So I think as we continue to hire, the hot skill sets are still the hot skill sets. It doesn't matter on, the rest of the world might be more of a buyer's market, but for those particular skill sets, they're still being highly sought after because they're more niche to the market. So if a company's looking to hire and there's all these mass layoffs, should we be thinking about hiring in a different way? Like, what is this person actually going to have to do walk in a door versus what are we going to be building later? Because that might change our list of like the must-haves walk in the door. And could an engineer who's really excited about coming in learn some of these additional things, but they're coming in with a really solid foundation? So I think, again, we just have to think about like who we're hiring in the now, and then where do we need to be as we continue to grow and scale, and how can we kind of piece those two things together?
True. And that goes back to kind of what I was trying to say before. The lack of funding, makes you more conscious, right, about how you can hire. And this talent is super expensive. So I think also, instead of constantly looking for the unicorn or the purple squirrel, as we call it in recruiting, is you may not be able to hire the very best of the best. So it's planning and anticipating, what are those key skill sets that I need, and can they complement each other? I had a biopharma company. They weren't super tech, but they were trying to build out a data science sort of team, and their budget was really minimal. And the leader I was impressed with how he kind of planned and defined what the team needed for specific skills. And he was able to hire kind of that core leader I was talking about before that could attract the talent and knew everything across. But he was able, I think he had to hire four data scientists. And we ended up hiring 2 that were more data analysts, where we felt they fit in really well culturally. They had all the intangible things, but that they could have the ability to learn new things, which will keep them excited and motivated. So there was that balance, because the average, I think, cost per hire is like $150,000 for people in these disciplines. And that's a lot for early stage companies.
Yeah, I mean, probably significantly higher.
Yeah. But I've seen, even with all the layoffs, I've had a lot of clients think, well, it's so much easier to find candidates now because so many people have been laid off. And that's really not the case either, because this talent is so still hard to find that I offered up 5 hours a week when all the layoffs were happening to help people with LinkedIn, with whatever, just to vent. And by the time I set up the second meeting 2 weeks later, every time they'd already gotten a job. So that goes back to the good process and being able to hire quickly and being ready. So
yeah, and I would echo that in my experience. I think good talent is always hard to find, and it's always a competitive game. And yes, there's some macro shifts, and certainly, companies are trimming projects or trimming initiatives that they could fund in, say, 2021, but they can't justify today. But it's always, especially for technical skill sets, which require often sort of advanced training, years of experience. I think it's always going to be a competitive market for that.
Agreed.
Yeah. This has been a really fun conversation, Peg and Abbie. Other thoughts, parting advice for our listeners? Anything you'd like to share before we wrap?
I mean, I think the biggest thing that we touched on, we kind of reiterated over and over is, we'd all prefer to hire B+ skills and A+ personalities, right?
Yeah.
Kind of the EQ over IQ. And that's going to really go a long way when it comes to retention, and having good and great processes set up and an amazing story to tell and pitch to candidates.
Absolutely. It's, I think, anticipating, what you need to do, attracting the talent, right? Engaging the talent. Where do we go to find them? And then retaining them and engaging them and upskilling them, whatever you need to do to keep them around. So.
Well, there you have it, folks. This is some incredible insight and advice from Peg and Abbie, who've helped build very large companies, hired hundreds of people across different roles. Thank you, Peg and Abbie, for carving out the time, and we really appreciate your insights for this audience.
Thank you.
This is Anmol, your host of the Autonomous Health Podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Bye.